It's Miss Lockley here from John Wilmot School. I just wanted to take some time to explain to you how we use knowledge organisers and a variety of different materials to support your home learning and retrieval practice at John Wilmot School. And like the quote at the bottom of that slide says, you have to learn how to learn. You have to learn how to think hard about things and recall information and derive key points and prioritise. And I thought it would be useful if I just went through some reasons why in 2017 we introduced knowledge organisers and we overhauled our home learning and retrieval policy, and what that means for you, really. So we know that in response to the huge changes around the curriculum, we have got to ensure that we transfer knowledge, all this material you need, from the working memory, which is a really small, limited part of your brain, to the long-term memory. And we know that that transference can sometimes be a little bit of a challenge. The working memory can hold around 5 things, and if you're not constantly recalling, retrieving, rehearsing, memorising, doing all of that, it just falls away. We call it decay. It decays. Our challenge is to get you to do things again and again so it gets embedded into your long-term memory. And I think these images are perfect because it shows, isn't it, how we can transfer things from a limited state of your brain and your memory to an unlimited, well-organised, long-term memory. And that's our goal. But we can't do that for you. There has to be some responsibility on your part to keep going back to material, to rehearse it, to deconstruct it, to make links, and to become really familiar with it. And we know the harder you think about the material and the knowledge that you've been taught, the more likely it is that you'll remember it. We know that regular retrieval practice ensures that knowledge is stored in the long-term memory, and this is the key point, that it remains accessible. If something's in the long-term memory but you still aren't going back to it, those pathways become a little bit foggy. And if you've been in a conversation, something's on the tip of your tongue but you can't quite get to it, it's because you haven't secured or made that pathway concrete. Those schemas of understanding haven't been referred to as regularly as they should, perhaps. And so we can see the more regularly you review something, the less you forget, the more you retain. So the retention rate is higher the more regularly you go back to things. Now, we only have a certain number of hours we can teach you, so we can cover all the content. We can't infinitely go back all of the time. Of course, we can encourage you to do that in Do It Now activities and in our teaching and insert activities, but you should be using your knowledge organisers, your books, your revision material regularly, every night, whether you're directed to or not, to maintain that well-organised long-term memory, to develop your schemas of understanding. And it's really, really important we support you in doing that. And that might be a bit alien to some of you. Certainly that's not the way I was taught. It's not the way home learning was when I was at school. But like I said at the beginning, in 2017 we needed to think again about how we used home learning and how we ensured it was supporting our students to better get the knowledge required to meet the needs of the curriculum and indeed terminal examinations in year 11 and year 13. So a lot of what we do as your subject teachers and as staff around the school is based around cognitive load. It's this idea that the more you remember, the more is in your long-term memory, the less likely you are to become overloaded. So we use lots of structures in our teaching. You're familiar with Triple E. We use lots of structures to try and get that knowledge embedded and allow us to revisit it, such as the Do It Nows, like I've mentioned. So in 2017 then we introduced knowledge organisers, and they've been really successful. They reduce cognitive load. Like I said, if you are not having to relearn things for the first time regularly, your brain can cope better because it's there in the long-term memory. You can just pull it up to the working memory and deal with it, rather than having to relearn things all the time. You should be using them nightly. You should, whether your teacher has said, I want you to look at your knowledge organiser and learn section C, you should be using them nightly. You should be able to identify your own gaps in knowledge. You should be able to identify what you need to go back and revisit. You should be able to identify what you could extend using your knowledge organiser. And your teachers may well direct you to specific areas to revise for an assessment or to consolidate, particularly if there were common misconceptions around an assessed piece. But those two things need to work in conjunction. You need to be revisiting your knowledge organisers yourself, as well as your teachers directing you. And that learning will be assessed in our very robust teaching and learning model. And again, this is something I think that is quite new to education, that we don't have to mark every single thing. We mark the things that really are going to matter and really going to move you on. We mark through questioning and through our teaching and learning model constantly, all the time. The questioning phase, should we go back to that? The questioning phase here is not just, a part of the lesson. That is an assessment phase. And we ask our staff to think very, very carefully about the questions they're asking, who they're asking them to, whereabouts in that lesson they're going to ask questions, and where are the big questions in that scheme of learning. We know that the knowledge organisers are also used really well as part of assessment and feedback. So when you have an assessed piece, the teacher might say, right, go back and with your green pen, fill in what you've missed out from section D. Or they might say, well, I've just asked you lots of questions in the class and you're not using the vocabulary which is in section B. So I want you to spend some time looking at that. I'm going to ask those questions again. So we know that best practice is to use them regularly as part of assessment and feedback. And I have spoken to you before numerous times about all the different strategies and techniques to manipulate your learning and develop that knowledge. We often say deepen your understanding or deepen your learning. Is to make sure the learning that you're doing is transferring from the working into the long-term memory and you're able to make links. Thinking hard about something and doing something with all that knowledge, all that material, allows you to remember it. So let's have a look. So thinking hard is one of the strategies that we talk about, and this is divided up into different sections. We have the knowledge and understanding, where you reduce, transform, deconstruct or derive the knowledge, the material. Analysis and application, so you can prioritise, categorise, criticise, spot trends and patterns and practice again and again and again. And lastly, the flexibility of thinking. This is where you might take a section of your knowledge organiser and make connections or compare, extend what's there, because actually a lot of the information is summarised, or you might create something else out of it. You might create a spider diagram or a flow map, or you might create a diagram. So thinking hard is about doing something with the information, with the knowledge, with that part of the curriculum, with the scheme of work that will allow you to better organise your long-term memory. You can do self-quizzing. This is really, really easy. So look at your knowledge organiser and test yourself. What can you recall? What have you missed out? What are your target areas? And it's about plugging those gaps of understanding. Now, on some of the knowledge organisers, there's questions already, but actually developing or creating your own questions are also part of thinking harder. Get someone to help you. You could quiz yourself and ask them to mark you. Is always a really, really useful way of testing your knowledge. And then thinking maps. These are used in lessons and they should not be alien to you. They should actually be fairly familiar. And you've got the thinking maps at the back of your home learning books. That you should be doing home learning in and writing your notes out in. And so you've got things like the comparing and contrasting double bubble map, where you can look at two things and look at the similarities and also look at the differences. This is something that I use quite a lot. The flow map, where I can sequence or plan out a response with detail underneath. Cause and effect is also a brilliant one, when you can look at the causes, the consequence and the effects. So you use these in a variety of subjects, and again it's about thinking hard and manipulating the knowledge and information at your fingertips in order for you to become really familiar with it and for you to be able to recall it much, much easier, because what you're being taught will be tested, and that's important. So you've got all of this information at the back of your knowledge organiser, but let's look at how we could use this in practice. So I've got here, let's look at a year 7 knowledge organiser. So we've got a year 7 knowledge organiser here. Let's bring this up. Now, I'm an English teacher, not a historian. So if I was looking at this as a year 7, what might I do? Well, I might look at this bit here, this section here. What was life like in towns and cities? I might make connections there. I might extend my learning, and I might make connections to what I know about what life was like in towns and cities. I might extend that with extra detail because that's quite summarised there. So here, for example, the King, the Mayor of London, does not care about public health. They did nothing to stop it. Well, could I extend that? Could I say who the King was, who the Mayor was, how I know they don't? Or that they didn't care about public health. Is there anything else I could do here to transform into cause and effect? Is there anything here that I could transform into a flow diagram, or could I make illustrations to explain something? So that's one way that you could look at this history knowledge organiser. But of course, it would be really important to target areas that you're most unfamiliar with. Should we look at another one? Oh gosh, I thought history was hard. This is year 9 chemistry, GCSE, the chemistry of the atmosphere. Okay, so again, what could I do here? I will self-quizzing. For me, the most obvious thing to do here, there's so much subject-specific terminology, self-quizzing. Even spelling particular words. So spelling, self-quizzing for recall and retrieval. Could I make connections to other topics? So for example, here, carbon footprints. What else do I know about carbon footprints? Could I reduce some of this into bullet points? So could I reduce that information? Again, that's one of the thinking harder strategies. Now, as well as knowledge organisers, what we also make good use of is Pixel Spine resources, and these are all on the John Wilmot School website. And Pixel Spine can be used at in any year group, any key stage at secondary. It's really challenging, incredibly challenging. And in fact, this one you're looking at here, I have used with my GCSE class and my A-level class, and equally you could use aspects of it when you're looking at Romeo and Juliet lower down the school. So it's called Spine because it's the backbone of knowledge. So we talk about cultural capital a lot in education, this idea that this understanding of how the world works, what things mean, how they're connected is really important. And I think sometimes people presume that students will know this stuff, and actually they don't. Do students know the origins of Greek tragedy? Well, you may do if your parents have taken you to lots of plays centred around Greek tragedy, or you've been to lots of museums, or you in your primary school you had a particularly enthusiastic teacher who taught you all about this. But otherwise, why would you know? But it's really important you do know, because Shakespeare used that tradition, and lots of more contemporary playwrights use that tradition. If you don't know that, then you can't really develop your nuances of understanding. So Pixel Spine is really interesting because it gives you key knowledge needed as part of the backbone to any subject. And some of these will overlap. So for example, key stage 3 spine tragedy you could look at that in drama at GCSE, you could look at it in media, you could look at it in English. There's elements that you could look at in terms of history as well, and RE. So again, the same applies. You could do self-quizzing. You could transform into spider diagrams. You could recall and retrieve key words, key vocabulary. There's questions on the Pixel Spine. Again, that's self-quizzing already there, but it's great as a starting point to extend